While European nobles were eating off wooden plates and relieving themselves in castle courtyards, there was a city in Africa where scholars debated philosophy in marble halls, and gold was so abundant that the emperor literally gave it away to strangers on the street. A city so wealthy that when its ruler went on vacation, he accidentally crashed the entire Mediterranean economy for a decade. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the true story of Timbuktu and the Mali Empire. A civilization so advanced and prosperous that it would make today's billionaires look like paupers. Picture this: while London was a muddy collection of wooden hovels where disease ran rampant, Timbuktu boasted 3-story buildings with indoor plumbing. While European monks painstakingly copied religious texts in cold monasteries, African scholars in Timbuktu were conducting original research in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine in temperature-controlled libraries housing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was staggering. But here's what they don't want you to know. This empire's downfall wasn't caused by war or natural disaster. It was something far more sinister. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this story was buried from history books for centuries. Our story begins in the 13th century in the heart of West Africa, where the Niger River bends like a golden serpent through the Sahara Desert. Here, at this picture this. While London was a muddy collection of wooden hovels, where disease ran rampant, Timbuktu boasted 3-story buildings with indoor plumbing. While European monks painstakingly copied religious texts in cold monasteries, African scholars in Timbuktu were conducting original research in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine in temperature-controlled libraries housing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was staggering. But here's what they don't want you to know. This empire's downfall wasn't caused by war or natural disaster. It was something far more sinister. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this story was buried from history books for centuries. Our story begins in the 13th century, in the heart of West Africa, where the Niger River bends like a golden serpent through the Sahara Desert. Here at this crucial crossroads between the Arab world and sub-Saharan Africa, a small trading post called Timbuktu was about to become the center of the wealthiest empire the medieval world had ever seen. But to understand how Timbuktu became the richest city on earth, we need to go back to the beginning, to a legend so incredible that even today, historians debate whether it really happened or if it's simply the most successful propaganda campaign in African history. The year was 1235. Across West Africa, dozens of small kingdoms and tribal confederations were locked in constant warfare, fighting over control of the region's most precious resources: gold, salt, and the trade routes that connected them. Into this chaos stepped a man whose very name would strike fear into the hearts of enemies and inspire legends that would echo through centuries: Sundiata Keita, the Lion King of Mali. But Sundiata's rise to power began with what appeared to be a devastating defeat. As a young prince, he was crippled from birth, unable to walk until his teenage years. His own people mocked him as weak, unsuitable for leadership. The griots, the oral historians of West Africa, sang songs that ridiculed the prince, who could only crawl while other boys ran and hunted. His own mother Sogalen was ostracized at court, and young Sundiata became a symbol of shame for the royal family. When his kingdom of Kangaba was conquered by the sorcerer king Sumanguru Kanti of Soso around Er Sanwu, Sundiata was forced into exile, wandering from court to court, begging for shelter and protection. But this exile would prove to be his greatest education. His first refuge was the kingdom of Mima, where the king recognized something in the young prince that others had missed: a brilliant strategic mind and an ability to inspire loyalty even in the darkest circumstances. In Mema, Sundiata learned the art of cavalry warfare, studying how the kingdom's horsemen could strike with devastating speed across the savannah. He observed their diplomatic protocols, understanding how smaller kingdoms survived by playing larger powers against each other. From there, his journey took him to the Wolof kingdoms near the Atlantic coast, where he learned about maritime trade and the complex networks that connected West African gold to North African merchants. Each kingdom he visited added another layer to his education. In the forests of the south, He learned guerrilla tactics from peoples who had resisted Sumanguru's expansion in the desert kingdoms of the north. He studied the logistics of long-distance trade and how economic power could be converted into political influence. But most importantly, during these years of wandering, Sundiata began to articulate a vision that would revolutionize West African politics. Here's where the story becomes almost mythical. During his years in exile, Sundiata didn't just survive. He learned. He studied the military tactics of different peoples, mastered the art of diplomacy, and most importantly, he began to understand something that would revolutionize African politics: the power of unity over division. The turning point came when messengers from his homeland brought news that Sumanguru's tyranny had become unbearable. The sorcerer king was demanding impossible tributes, executing rivals, and destroying the traditional social structures that had maintained peace for generations. Sundiata saw his opportunity. He sent emissaries to every kingdom he had visited during his exile, calling for a grand alliance against a common enemy. What made Sundiata's coalition revolutionary wasn't just its size, it was its structure. Rather than demanding submission, he offered partnership. Each allied kingdom would maintain its autonomy and traditional leadership, but they would unite under a common framework of laws and mutual defense. This was the seed of what would become the Mandan Charter. When Sundiata finally returned to challenge Sumanguru in 1235, he didn't come back as a single warrior seeking revenge. He came back as the leader of a coalition that included dozens of previously rival tribes, all united under a revolutionary concept: the Mandan Charter. Perhaps the world's first written constitution. The Battle of Karina, where Sundiata defeated Sumanguru, wasn't just a military victory. It was a clash of two visions for West Africa's future. Sumanguru represented the old way, rule through fear, sorcery, and brute force. Sundiata represented something new, through law, consensus, and shared prosperity. The battle itself was fought near the town of Kirana, in what is now Guinea. Sumanguru's forces held the high ground, and his reputation as an invincible sorcerer had already demoralized many of Sundiata's allies. But Sundiata had learned something during his exile: the power of psychological warfare. He had discovered Sumanguru's one weakness, a superstitious fear of white roosters, which were said to break his magical protections. Whether through genuine sorcery or brilliant propaganda, Sundiata's forces used arrows tipped with white rooster spurs in the battle. When one struck Sumanguru, the sorcerer king's confidence shattered. His army, seeing their supposedly invincible leader wounded, broke and fled. Sumanguru himself disappeared into the mountains, never to be seen again, though legends say he transformed into stone to escape his shame. The victory at Kirana was the birth of a new kind of African state. The Mandan Charter established principles that were centuries ahead of their time: protection for women and children during warfare, environmental conservation laws, and most remarkably, a declaration that all human life is a life, an explicit rejection of the caste systems and slavery that dominated much of the medieval world. The charter established that disputes should be resolved through dialogue rather than violence, that women should have property rights, and that the natural environment should be protected for future generations. It also created a federal system where local rulers maintained authority over their territories but contributed to a central government that managed defense, trade policy, and dispute resolution between member states. This wasn't just revolutionary for Africa, it was revolutionary for the entire medieval world. While European kingdoms were still operating under feudal systems where peasants were essentially property, the Mandan Charter was establishing principles of human dignity and environmental stewardship that would underappear in European law for another 5 centuries. The charter was proclaimed orally by griots and became the constitutional foundation of the Mali Empire. It established that result was sustainable prosperity on a scale that medieval Europe couldn't imagine. While European mines were typically exhausted within a generation, Mali's gold mines produced consistently for centuries. The environmental wisdom embedded in these practices was unaccidental. It reflected a sophisticated understanding that wealth extracted at the cost of the land as fertility was wealth borrowed from future generations. Mining communities developed elaborate systems of land management where agricultural plots were rotated with mining operations, ensuring that families could sustain themselves even as they extracted precious metals from the earth. But gold and salt were just the beginning. The real genius of the Mali Empire lay in understanding that wealth without knowledge is temporary, but knowledge without wealth is powerless. And this is where Timbuktu enters our story. Around 1100 CE, long before Mali's golden age, Timbuktu began as nothing more than a seasonal camp for Tuareg nomads. The name itself comes from Timbuktu, meaning the place of a Butu, named after an old woman who was left to guard the camp. As well, while the men traveled with their herds across the desert, picture this elderly Tuareg woman sitting beside a simple well in the middle of nowhere, waiting for her people to return from their seasonal migrations. She had no idea that this humble well would become the foundation of one of the most magnificent cities in the medieval world. The location was perfect by accident. Timbuktu sat at the point where the Niger River comes closest to the Sahara Desert, the natural meeting place between the Bodasing peoples of the river and the Kamolasing peoples of the desert. It was where two completely different worlds of trade and culture intersected. By 1200, what had started as a simple well had grown into a small trading post. Merchants from the south would arrive by boat carrying gold, ivory, and slaves. Merchants from the north would arrive by camel caravan carrying salt, horses, and manufactured goods from North Africa and the Mediterranean. But what transformed Timbuktu from a simple trading post into something unprecedented was Sundiata's vision of what a city could become. When the Mali Empire incorporated Timbuktu around 1240, Sundiata didn't just want to control the trade that passed through the city. He wanted to create something that had never existed in sub-Saharan Africa, a center of learning that could rival the great cities of the Islamic world. What started as pragmatic policy became revolutionary vision. Sundiata began offering protection and incentives to scholars, teachers, and craftsmen who would settle in Timbuktu. He established the first libraries, the first schools, the first institutions that would make knowledge, not just trade, the foundation of urban prosperity. By 1300, under Mali's protection and patronage, Timbuktu had become a magnet for scholars, merchants, and artisans from across the known world. The cities, the administrative machinery that made this possible, operated with a precision that would impress modern bureaucrats. Consider how the messenger relay system actually functioned. When a trade dispute erupted in the copper-producing region of Takeda in 1315, a messenger departed at dawn, carrying a sealed message describing the conflict. He rode to the first relay station 20 miles away, where a fresh horse and rider were already waiting. The message was transferred, and the new rider departed within minutes. By nightfall, the message had traveled over 200 miles. Within 3 days, it reached Niani, the capital. A journey that would have taken a merchant caravan 3 weeks. Mansa Musa's response, including specific instructions for arbitration, made the return journey in the same time frame. The rotating governor system prevented the kind of corruption that plagued other medieval empires through elegant simplicity. Governors served 3-year terms in provinces far from their home regions, ensuring they had no local power base to exploit. When Governor Mahmoud of Gao was rotated to Walata in 1318, he arrived to find detailed records of tax collection, trade volumes, and judicial decisions from his predecessor. Any discrepancies would be immediately apparent. More importantly, he knew that in 3 years, another governor would scrutinize his own records with equal care. The system created a culture of accountability that made embezzlement not just risky, but nearly impossible. The Takeda dispute itself demonstrates how Mali's legal system actually worked in practice. Copper miners claimed that merchants from Timbuktu were using false weights to cheat them in transactions. Rather than simply imposing a decision from the capital, Mansa Musa dispatched a 3-judge panel that included a scholar from Timbuktu's university, a merchant from a neutral city, and a mining expert from another copper-producing region. They spent 2 weeks in Takeda, examining weights, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing transaction records. Their verdict was nuanced. Some Timbuktu merchants had indeed used deceptive practices, but the Miners' Guild had also been inflating quality claims about their copper. The judges imposed fines on the guilty merchants. required the Miners' Guild to implement quality standards, and established a permanent inspector position to verify weights and measures in all future transactions. Both sides accepted the ruling because the process had been transparent and fair. This wasn't just justice, it was conflict resolution that strengthened rather than damaged trade relationships. These weren't isolated examples. This was how Mali's government functioned across an empire larger than Western Europe, day after day, year after year. The administrative sophistication that made this possible was built on systems that Sundiata had established and that Mansa Musa had perfected into something approaching modern governance. The Cairo marketplace on the third day of Mansa Musa's visit was unlike anything the city had ever witnessed. The Khan El-Khalili Bazaar, normally a cacophony of haggling voices and competing merchants, fell into stunned silence as Musa's procession entered. He walked flanked by 12 attendants, each carrying leather pouches that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold diner. At a textile merchant's stall, Musa paused to examine a bolt of Damascus silk, its deep crimson color catching the morning light. The merchant, a weathered Syrian named Ahmad ibn Rashid, later recounted the encounter to the historian Al-Amari. I told him the silk was worth 20 dinars. He looked at me as if I had insulted him by naming such a small sum. He handed me 100 dinars and said, "Keep the change for your children." When I protested, he simply smiled and moved to the next stall. This scene repeated itself throughout Cairo. At a spice merchant's shop, Musa purchased saffron, cardamom, and rare Indonesian cloves, paying 5 times the asking price. At a jeweler's workshop, he commissioned a dozen gold necklaces embedded with Egyptian turquoise, then paid the craftsman enough to retire comfortably. The jeweler's hands trembled as he accepted the payment, unable to comprehend such casual generosity. Musa's daily routine in Cairo followed a precise schedule that demonstrated both his piety and his diplomatic acumen. He rose before dawn for morning prayers at the Sultan's mosque, where his presence drew crowds of curious Cairenes who had never seen such wealth displayed with such humility. After prayers, he held court in the palace quarters provided by Sultan al-Nasser Muhammad, receiving delegations from across the Islamic world. These diplomatic meetings were masterclasses in statecraft. With Mamluk officials, Musa discussed trade routes and security arrangements for Malian pilgrims. One meeting, recorded in Mamluk archives, shows Musa negotiating safe passage agreements. "Your caravans pass through our lands unmolested," he told the Sultan's vizier. "We ask only the same courtesy for our merchants traveling north." But he sweetened every negotiation with gifts, gold, ivory, and rare manuscripts from Timbuktu's libraries. In the afternoons, Musa met with scholars at Al-Azhar University, engaging in theological debates and discussing advances in mathematics and astronomy. He took careful notes, later telling his advisors, "Every conversation here is worth more than gold. We must bring this knowledge home." The evenings were reserved for more informal gatherings, where Musa entertained Cairo's elite with stories of Mali's cities and kingdoms. These weren't mere social occasions, they were carefully orchestrated propaganda campaigns designed to reshape how the Islamic world viewed sub-Saharan Africa. The return journey from Mecca began in late 1324, and Mansa Musa was a changed man. The spiritual fulfillment of completing the Hajj had given him a profound sense of purpose, but the economic chaos he'd witnessed in Cairo had taught him a harsh lesson about the responsibility that came with Mali's wealth. This time, his spending would be strategic, not ostentatious. His first major stop was Medina, where he spent 2 weeks in quiet contemplation at the Prophet's mosque. Here, he recruited Ibrahim al-Dakhali, a renowned Islamic scholar who specialized in Maliki jurisprudence, the legal tradition most compatible with West African customs. Al-Dakhali would later become one of the chief judges in Timbuktu's expanding legal system. In Cairo, Musa faced the consequences of his earlier generosity. The gold market was still in chaos, with prices for basic goods inflated beyond recognition. The common people who had initially celebrated his largesse now struggled to afford bread. Musa was horrified. He spent weeks working with Egyptian merchants to stabilize the market, actually borrowing gold at high interest rates to remove currency from circulation. It was an expensive lesson in monetary policy, but one he would never forget. From Cairo, he traveled to Alexandria, where he recruited Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, the Andalusian architect whose expertise in desert construction would transform Timbuktu's skyline. Al-Sahili brought with him detailed plans for buildings that could withstand the Sahara's harsh climate, while incorporating the sophisticated aesthetic principles of Islamic architecture. In Tunis, Musa spent 3 weeks meeting with scholars from the Zaytuna Mosque, one of the Islamic world's great centers of learning. Here he recruited Muhammad ibn Mahmud, a mathematician and astronomer who would establish Timbuktu's first astronomical observatory, and Fatima al-Firi, a scholar of medicine who brought with her texts on surgical techniques unknown in West Africa. As the caravan finally turned south, toward the Sahara, Musa felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in what he had accomplished. Mali's name was now known throughout the Islamic world. Anxiety about what he would find at home after more than a year's absence. And most powerfully, a burning determination to transform everything he had learned into lasting achievements that would secure Mali's place in history. The desert crossing gave him time to think, to plan, to imagine the Timbuktu he would build. Each night, as he sat with his newly recruited scholars around the campfire, they discussed architecture, astronomy, medicine, and law. By the time the caravan reached the Niger River, Musa had developed a comprehensive vision for Mali's next chapter. The pilgrimage had been about demonstrating Mali's wealth to the world. What came next would be about demonstrating its wisdom. Them priceless treasures. Each horse was attended by its own groom, fed a special diet of dates and grain, and housed in portable stables that were assembled at each stop along the route. The logistics of moving such a massive caravan were staggering. Water had to be secured at every oasis, with advanced scouts sent ahead to ensure adequate supplies. Food for 60,000 people required careful planning. Dried meats, grains, dates, and other preserved foods were transported in quantities that would have supplied a small city. The caravan also carried its own mobile marketplace, with merchants traveling alongside to provide goods and services to the travelers. There were mobile blacksmiths to repair equipment, physicians to treat the sick and injured, and even entertainers, musicians, storytellers, and acrobats to provide diversion during the long journey. The security arrangements were equally elaborate. Though Musa traveled as a pilgrim, he was still an emperor, and the caravan included a substantial military escort. These weren't just guards, they were elite warriors, many of them veterans of Mali's campaigns, armed with the finest weapons and armor available. They rode in formation around the caravan, maintaining a perimeter that extended for miles in every direction. But their presence was more symbolic than practical. The reputation of Mali's military power was such that no bandit or rival ruler would dare attack the emperor's caravan. The military escort was there to demonstrate power, not to use it. Larger, more durable buildings in desert climates. From Egyptian scholars, he learned about new developments in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine that could benefit Timbuktu's growing university. But most importantly, Musa learned about new financial instruments and trading practices that would allow Mali to engage directly with Asian markets without relying on North African intermediaries. He discovered that there were sea routes connecting the Indian Ocean with the Atlantic that could potentially allow Mali to trade directly with India, China, and Southeast Asia. The most significant meeting was with Ibn Battuta, the great medieval traveler, who was so impressed by Musa's knowledge and wealth that he decided to visit Mali personally. When Ibn Battuta eventually reached Timbuktu in 1353, his written account would provide the world with the first detailed description of Mali's extraordinary civilization. But Musa also learned some disturbing information during his time in Mecca. Portuguese explorers were already pushing down the Atlantic coast of Africa, clearly searching for a sea route to the sources of African gold. The Ottoman Empire was expanding westward, potentially threatening the northern terminals of the trade routes that were the foundation of Mali's prosperity. Most ominously, Musa learned that European merchants and rulers were beginning to ask detailed questions about Mali's military capabilities, political structure, and potential vulnerabilities. The empire's wealth had made it famous, but fame could be dangerous if it attracted the wrong kind of attention. When Musa began his return journey to Mali in 1325, he was carrying more than just new knowledge and diplomatic connections. He was carrying a terrible understanding. By revealing Mali's wealth so dramatically, he had also revealed its vulnerabilities. The empire that had prospered in relative isolation was now on everyone's map, literally and figuratively. And what he did when he returned to Timbuktu would determine whether Mali's golden age would continue or whether it had just signed its own death warrant. When Mansa Musa's caravan finally appeared on the horizon outside Timbuktu in early 1326, the city's residents witnessed something unprecedented in African history: the return of a ruler who had become an international celebrity. Word of Musa's spectacular pilgrimage had traveled back to Mali through trade networks, and the entire empire was buzzing with stories of their emperor's legendary generosity and the impression he had made on the Islamic world. But Musa returned as a changed man. The provincial African king, who had left Mali 2 years earlier, had been replaced by a sophisticated international statesman who understood both the opportunities and the dangers that Mali's newfound fame had created. Musa brought with him more than just stories and souvenirs. He had recruited some of the finest architects, scholars, and craftsmen from the Islamic world, offering them salaries that no European court could match. Among them was eased the fate of Timbuktu's intellectual community in the aftermath of the Moroccan conquest. Represents one of history's most devastating cultural catastrophes. When Judor Pacha's forces breached the city walls in 1591, the systematic destruction of knowledge began almost immediately. Ahmad Baba al-Masufi, perhaps the greatest scholar of his generation and author of over 40 works on Islamic jurisprudence, was arrested along with his entire family. The Moroccans seized his personal library of 1,600 manuscripts, the largest private collection in the city, and shipped them to Marrakesh. Ahmad Baba himself was imprisoned for 2 years before being exiled to Morocco, where he would spend 14 years in captivity, forbidden from teaching or writing. The astronomer Muhammad al-Kaburi, whose calculations of planetary movements had been more accurate than contemporary European tables, was killed defending the Sankar Mosque's library. His life's work, including detailed astronomical charts and a revolutionary treatise on celestial navigation, was burned by Moroccan soldiers who saw no value in papers covered with numbers and diagrams. The physician Mahmoud Kadi, grandson of the famous chronicler, fled south to Jen with whatever manuscripts he could carry. His medical texts, which synthesized Greek, Arabic, and African healing traditions, were scattered across multiple cities, their unified knowledge fragmented forever. The destruction was methodical and merciless. The great library of Sankar, which had housed over 700,000 manuscripts, was systematically looted. Works on advanced mathematics, including algebraic solutions that wouldn't be discovered in Europe for another century, were used as kindling by soldiers who couldn't read Arabic. A complete copy of Euclid's Elements with original African commentaries was torn apart, its pages used to wrap food. Medical texts describing surgical procedures for cataracts, a technique European doctors wouldn't master until the 18th century, were thrown into the Niger River. By 1595, fewer than a dozen of Timbuktu's original 180 Quranic schools remained operational. The University of Spar, which had educated thousands of students from across Africa and the Islamic world, was reduced to a single elderly teacher instructing 7 students in a damaged building. The book markets that had once rivaled those of Cairo and Baghdad stood empty, their stalls abandoned or converted to sell grain and cloth. The intellectual light that had burned so brightly for 3 centuries was systematically extinguished. And with it died the proof that African civilization had achieved heights that would not be matched again for generations, that drained resources from military defense. The elaborate irrigation systems needed constant maintenance that became impossible as skilled engineers fled or were killed. The diplomatic networks that had taken decades to build unraveled within years as neighboring kingdoms sensed weakness and opportunity. The gold mines that had funded everything required sophisticated management and security that Mali's weakened government could no longer provide. But here's what makes this period so fascinating and so tragic. Even as Mali's political power declined, even as its borders contracted and its armies suffered defeats, the intellectual and cultural achievements that Musa had fostered continued to flourish in Timbuktu for another 2 centuries. The universities kept teaching, the scholars kept writing, the libraries kept growing. It was as if the city had developed a momentum of its own, independent of the empire that had created it. The Sankar University, which Musa had expanded and endowed, became even more prestigious after his death. By 1400, it had over 25,000 students from across Africa, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe. The curriculum had expanded beyond Islamic law and theology to include advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, and what we would now call social sciences. Scholars were conducting original research that wouldn't be replicated in Europe for centuries. One of the most remarkable figures of this period was Ahmad Baba al-Masufi, born in Timbuktu in 1556, nearly 2 centuries after Musa's death. By the time he was 30, Ahmad Baba had written over 40 books on topics ranging from Islamic jurisprudence to biography to grammar. His personal library contained over 1,600 volumes, and he claimed this was one of the smaller collections among Timbuktu's scholarly families. Think about that for a moment. In 1586, while Europe was just beginning to recover from the Dark Ages, a single scholar in Timbuktu owned more books than most European universities. Ahmad Baba's work on Islamic law was so sophisticated that it's still studied today. But what makes his scholarship particularly remarkable was his willingness to challenge established authorities and develop new interpretations based on careful reasoning and evidence. This wasn't blind adherence to tradition. This was genuine intellectual inquiry of the highest order. The medical knowledge being developed in Timbuktu during this period was equally impressive. Physicians were performing cataract surgeries, treating mental illness with a combination of medication and what we would now call psychotherapy, and developing treatments for tropical diseases that wouldn't be understood in Europe until the 19th century. They had detailed anatomical knowledge gained from careful observation and, in some cases, dissection, practices that were forbidden in medieval Europe. The astronomical observations being made in Timbuktu were accurate enough to create calendars that could predict eclipses and planetary movements years in advance. Mathematicians were working with concepts of zero and negative numbers that European scholars would unfully grasp for another century. Chemists were developing techniques for refining metals and creating compounds that required sophisticated understanding of chemical reactions. But perhaps most impressive was the historical and geographical knowledge being compiled. Timbuktu scholars were creating detailed maps of Africa that showed trade routes, cities, kingdoms, and natural resources with remarkable accuracy. They were writing histories that documented the rise and fall of empires, the movements of peoples, and the development of cultures across the continent. This wasn't mythology or legend. This was careful historical scholarship based on written records, oral traditions, and eyewitness accounts. The book trade that Musa had encouraged continued to thrive. Scribes were copying manuscripts by hand, creating beautiful, illuminated texts that were works of art as well as scholarship. A single high-quality Quran could take a year to produce and sell for enough gold to buy a house. Rare scholarly works commanded even higher prices. European merchants who made it to Timbuktu reported that books were more valuable than any other commodity in the city. The preservation of Timbuktu's intellectual heritage wasn't accomplished by institutions or governments. It was carried out by ordinary families who understood that these manuscripts represented something irreplaceable. They hid books in metal trunks buried beneath their homes. They sealed them in clay jars and concealed them in the walls of their houses. They wrapped them in leather and cloth and stored them in secret rooms that only family members knew existed. For generations, these families passed down not just the manuscripts themselves, but the sacred duty to protect them. Consider the Kadi family, descendants of the scholar Mahmud Kadi, who wrote the Tariq al-Fatash, one of the most important historical chronicles of West Africa, in the 16th century. When the Moroccan invasion came, the family scattered the manuscripts among different relatives. When French colonial authorities arrived centuries later, demanding that valuable books be turned over to European museums. The Cady family claimed they had nothing of value. They continued teaching their children to read the old Arabic script, to understand the importance of what they were protecting, and to never reveal the full extent of their collection to outsiders. By the 1990s, the Cady family's collection had grown to over 3,000 manuscripts, some dating back to the 13th century. But they were deteriorating. The desert climate, insects, and simple age were destroying them. Ismail Diadi Haidara, a Timbuktu librarian whose own family had preserved manuscripts for generations, began a desperate campaign to save what remained of the city's intellectual heritage. He established a Mama Haidara library, named after his father, and began the painstaking work of cataloging, preserving, and digitizing manuscripts that had been hidden for centuries. What Haidara and other preservationists discovered was staggering. Families across Timbuktu had been hiding manuscripts in their homes, sometimes without fully understanding what they possessed. One family had a 14th-century medical text describing surgical procedures for cataracts. Another had astronomical charts that accurately predicted planetary movements. A third had a philosophical treatise that engaged with Greek philosophy in ways that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of logic and metaphysics. The work of preservation accelerated in the early 2000s as international organizations began to recognize the importance of these manuscripts. The Ahmed Baba Institute, named after the great scholar, was established with support from South Africa and became the primary repository for Timbuktu's manuscripts. By 2012, over 300,000 manuscripts had been collected, cataloged, and were in the process of being digitized. Then, disaster struck. In 2012, militant groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda seized control of northern Mali, including Timbuktu. These militants, who claimed to represent Islam, viewed the manuscripts as heretical because they represented a sophisticated, tolerant, intellectually curious version of Islamic civilization that contradicted their rigid ideology. They began systematically destroying the manuscripts, burning them in the streets, and using them as fuel for cooking fires. But the people of Timbuktu weren't going to let centuries of preservation be destroyed by ignorance. In one of the most remarkable rescue operations in the history of cultural preservation, librarians and ordinary citizens smuggled manuscripts out of the city. They packed them in metal trunks and wooden crates. They hid them under vegetables in market trucks. They transported them by donkey, by boat, down the Niger River, and by car through militant checkpoints, claiming they were carrying nothing but personal belongings. Abdel Kader Haidara Ismail's son, who had taken over the preservation work, coordinated the evacuation of over 350,000 manuscripts from Timbuktu to Bamako, Mali's capital, where they could be hidden in private homes until the militants were driven out. The operation took months and involved hundreds of people risking their lives. Several were killed at checkpoints when militants discovered what they were carrying. But the vast majority of Timbuktu's manuscripts were saved. When researchers finally gained full access to these rescued manuscripts and began serious study, they discovered knowledge that fundamentally changed our understanding of medieval African civilization. Medical texts described treatments for malaria using compounds derived from local plants. Treatments that modern pharmaceutical research has confirmed contain active ingredients effective against the disease. Astronomical observations showed that African scholars had independently discovered several celestial phenomena that Europeans would unobserve for another century. Mathematical manuscripts revealed that African scholars were working with advanced algebra and geometry, including concepts that wouldn't appear in European mathematics until the Renaissance. One manuscript contained a proof of what Europeans call the Pythagorean theorem that used a completely different logical approach than the Greek proof, suggesting independent mathematical discovery. Perhaps most remarkable were the philosophical texts. These manuscripts showed African scholars engaging with questions of ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics with sophistication that rivaled anything being produced in medieval Europe or the Islamic heartlands. They weren't simply copying or commenting on Greek or Arab philosophers. They were developing original arguments, challenging established positions, and creating new philosophical frameworks. The historical chronicles provided detailed accounts of political systems, economic policies, and social structures that demonstrated levels of governmental sophistication that most historians had assumed didn't exist in medieval Africa. These weren't primitive kingdoms ruled by despots. These were complex federal systems with checks and balances, written constitutions, and legal frameworks that protected individual rights in ways that medieval Europe couldn't match. It was the birth of a new kind of African state. The Mandan Charter established principles that were centuries ahead of their time: protection for women and children during warfare, environmental conservation laws, and most remarkably, a system of social organization that balanced individual rights with collective responsibility. But what made Sundiata's empire different wasn't just military conquest or political innovation. Sundiata understood something that European rulers of his time could ungrasp. True power came not from oppressing your people, but from creating systems that made everyone prosper. Imagine standing on the banks of the Niger River in the year 1250, just 15 years after Sundiata's victory. To your north, the Sahara Desert stretches endlessly. But this isn't the barren wasteland many imagine. Hidden beneath its sands lie some of the richest salt mines in the world. Salt, so valuable that a pound of it could literally be traded for a pound of gold. The town of Tagaza, deep in the Sahara, was essentially a city built entirely of salt. The houses were made of salt blocks. The streets were paved with salt. Even the furniture was carved from solid salt. Slaves worked in these mines under conditions so harsh that few survived more than a few years. But the profits were so enormous that merchants considered this an acceptable cost of doing business. To your south, in the regions of Bambouk and Bure, rivers carry gold dust like glittering promises downstream. But here's the fascinating part. The people of Mali didn't just stumble upon these resources. They built an entire civilization around controlling and refining them. The Malayan miners had developed techniques for extracting gold that were so advanced they would be surpassed until the Industrial Revolution. They created underground networks that stretched for hundreds of miles, with ventilation systems that kept miners safe at depths that would challenge modern equipment. They had developed techniques for separating gold from sand and gravel that were more efficient than anything used in medieval Europe. But perhaps most ingeniously, they had solved the fundamental problem of medieval mining: how to extract valuable resources without destroying the environment that sustained local communities. Malian gold mines operated on rotation systems that allowed the land to recover between mining seasons. They developed techniques for replanting vegetation and managing water resources as they extracted precious metals from the earth. But gold and salt were just the beginning of Mali's economic sophistication. The empire controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes, where completely different worlds of trade and culture intersected. By 1200, what had started as a simple exchange of goods had evolved into something far more complex. Not just trade, but the foundation of urban prosperity. The administrative machinery that made this possible operated with a precision that would impress modern bureaucrats. Mali's tax collection system was based on detailed records that made embezzlement not just risky, but nearly impossible. The Takeda dispute itself demonstrates how Mali's legal system could handle complex commercial conflicts, creating resolution that strengthened rather than damaged trade relationships. These weren't isolated examples. This was how Mali's entire system functioned: a sophisticated blend of traditional African governance structures and Islamic jurisprudence. What Sundiata and his successors created in Mali wasn't just a kingdom. It was a financial system that included letters of credit that could be redeemed across the empire at a predetermined rate. This system, which wouldn't appear in Europe for another 2 centuries, made long-distance trade practical and secure. And then came a ruler who would show Europe and Asia that there were kingdoms in Africa that made their kingdoms look like villages. That man was Mansa Musa. And what he did would change the world's understanding of Africa forever. Mansa Musa came to power in 1312, and from the beginning, there was something different about him that set him apart from most medieval rulers. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man who spoke multiple languages, who could debate theology with Islamic scholars and discuss trade policy with merchants. He understood that Mali's wealth wasn't just about extracting resources. It was about creating systems that generated sustainable prosperity. He had created sustainable peace and prosperity across a continent-spanning empire. How did he do it? Musa reorganized Mali's provincial administration, appointing governors who were also military commanders, judges, and what we would now call economic development officers. These officials were rotated regularly to prevent the accumulation of local power bases. He standardized weights and measures across the empire, making trade more efficient. He established a banking system that allowed merchants to conduct transactions across thousands of miles without carrying physical gold. The result, by 1320, Mali was generating wealth equivalent to the combined treasuries of several European kingdoms. But Musa faced a problem that no amount of administrative genius could solve. Mali was producing so much gold that if he released it all into circulation, it would trigger massive inflation that would hurt his own people. If he hoarded the gold, it would strangle trade and economic growth. His solution was audacious. He would take Mali's gold on a pilgrimage to Mecca, distributing it strategically along the way to establish Mali's reputation, build diplomatic relationships, and demonstrate to the Islamic world, and by extension, to Europe and Asia, that Africa was home to a civilization that rivaled anything in Cairo, Baghdad, or Constantinople. In 1324, Mansa Musa set out on his legendary Hajj. The caravan that left Mali that year was unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. Contemporary Arab historians, who had witnessed the processions of sultans and caliphs, were left speechless by what they saw approaching across the desert. The caravan included 60,000 people, not just soldiers and servants, but scholars, architects, doctors, and administrators. There were 12,000 slaves, each dressed in fine Persian silk and carrying a golden staff, weighing 4 pounds. But these weren't ordinary slaves in the brutal sense that Europeans would later practice. Many were skilled craftsmen, administrators, and scholars who held positions of significant responsibility within Mali's government. Their slavery was more akin to indentured service, and many would return to Mali as free men with wealth and status. The caravan brought 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold dust. That's 24,000 pounds of gold roughly, 12 tons being transported across the Sahara. To put this in perspective, this was more gold than most European kingdoms possessed in their entire treasuries. When Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo in July 1324, the city's residents had never seen anything like it. Cairo was one of the largest and most sophisticated cities on earth, the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled trade routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Cairenes considered themselves cosmopolitan and worldly. They had seen wealthy merchants and powerful rulers from across the known world. But Mansa Musa did something that left the entire court speechless. As a gesture of goodwill, he began distributing gold with such lavish generosity that within weeks, he actually ran low on spending money. So he borrowed gold from Cairo's merchants at interest, becoming perhaps the first ruler in history to take out an international loan, not out of necessity, but as a financial strategy to stabilize the currency market he had disrupted with his own generosity. The economic impact was immediate and dramatic. Cairo's gold market, suddenly flushed with Malian gold, began purchasing goods from European and Asian traders at prices that made those merchants wealthy beyond their dreams. But more importantly, it forced European and Asian powers to develop a new understanding of the political and economic systems that produced this wealth. For the first time, European merchants and diplomats began to understand that there was a sophisticated civilization in West Africa that they knew almost nothing about. But what happened in Mecca itself was even more significant for the future of Mali and the broader Islamic world. In Mecca, Mansa Musa met with scholars, merchants, and diplomats from across the Islamic world. He learned about new technologies, new ideas about governance, new approaches to education. He recruited architects, scholars, and craftsmen to return with him to Mali. He established diplomatic relationships with rulers from Egypt to Persia, creating networks that could potentially allow Mali to trade directly with India, China, and Southeast Asia. The most important decision Mansa Musa made during his pilgrimage wasn't about gold or diplomacy. It was about knowledge. He realized that Mali's future depended not just on its gold mines, but on its ability to generate, preserve, and transmit knowledge. What he did when he returned to Timbuktu would determine whether Mali's golden age would continue, or whether it would fade like so many empires before it. When Mansa Musa returned to Mali in 1325, he brought with him scholars, architects, and craftsmen whose skills exceeded anything any European court could match. Among them was Issa Haile, the Andalusian architect who would transform Timbuktu's skyline and establish architectural principles that would influence West African building design for centuries. Musa's first priority was architecture. The Great Mosque of Timbuktu, which still stands today, was designed by Issa Haile, using techniques that combined traditional West African building methods with Islamic architectural principles. But Musa's vision went far beyond religious buildings. He commissioned the construction of libraries, schools, and what we would now call research institutes. The University of Sankar, which Musa expanded and reorganized, became something more like a modern research institution than a medieval school. Scholars didn't just teach and copy existing texts. They conducted original research in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. They experimented with combining Islamic medical knowledge with traditional African healing practices, creating treatments that were more effective than anything available in medieval Europe. Timbuktu scholars were engaged in cutting-edge research, participating in international scholarly debates, and creating new works that synthesized Islamic scholarship with African traditional knowledge and empirical observation. The book trade became one of Timbuktu's most profitable industries. A single high-quality manuscript could sell for more than a herd of cattle or a house in the city center. But Musa understood that knowledge alone wasn't enough. Mali needed to expand its diplomatic and commercial networks. He sent exploration missions to the Atlantic coast, not just to map territory, but to investigate the possibility of maritime trade routes. These explorers weren't just interested in trade. They were gathering intelligence. Their exploration missions included geographers, linguists, and what we would now call anthropologists, studying the peoples and resources of regions that Mali might incorporate or trade with. The Golden Age that Mansa Musa created in Timbuktu would last for nearly 2 centuries. But like all golden ages, it would eventually end not through gradual decline, but through violent conquest and deliberate destruction. In 1591, a Moroccan army crossed the Sahara and conquered Timbuktu. The soldiers were interested in gold, but their commanders understood that Timbuktu's real wealth was its knowledge. The Moroccan Sultan, Ahmed al-Mansur, ordered his forces to arrest Timbuktu scholars and send them to Marrakesh. The mathematician Ahmad Baba, whose work on algebra wouldn't be matched in Europe until the 18th century, spent years in captivity, forbidden from teaching or writing. The astronomer Muhammad al-Kabari, whose calculations of planetary movements were more accurate than European astronomical tables until the 18th century, saw his life's work, thousands of pages of observations and calculations, thrown into the Niger River. By 1595, fewer than a dozen of Timbuktu's major scholars remained free. The rest were dead, in exile, or imprisoned. The universities were closed. The libraries were looted or burned. The book trade collapsed. The intellectual networks that had connected Timbuktu to Cairo, Baghdad, and Cordoba were severed. But the destruction of Mali's Golden Age wasn't just a work of Moroccan invaders. It was also the result of internal weaknesses and external pressures that had been building for decades. The forces that Mansa Musa had set in motion, the expansion of trade, the accumulation of wealth, the attraction of scholars and merchants from across the Islamic world, had also made Mali a target for rivals who saw opportunity in challenging Mali's regional dominance. Musa understood that Mali's wealth had made it vulnerable. He had worked to create defensive systems, diplomatic alliances, and administrative structures that could preserve Mali's prosperity even after his death. But he could unsolve the fundamental problem of even the most sophisticated medieval empire, the problem of succession. Despite Mali's advanced administrative systems, the empire still relied on the personal authority and capability of its ruler. When weak or incompetent rulers came to power, the entire system began to break down. The massive spending on Musa's pilgrimage, combined with the massive construction projects in Timbuktu, had actually strained even Mali's enormous gold reserves. The empire's enemies were growing stronger and bolder. The Portuguese had established trading posts on the West African coast, and they were no longer content to trade with North African intermediaries. They wanted direct access to the source of Africa's gold. The Songhai Empire, which had been a vassal state of Mali, was growing in power and ambition. The Songhai had always been skilled warriors and traders, but they had accepted Mali's dominance because Mali's military and economic power made resistance futile. But by the late 15th century, new military technologies were becoming available in West Africa. Portuguese traders were selling firearms to African rulers, and the Songhai were quick to adopt these new weapons. The Tuareg nomads of the Sahara, who had been kept in check by Mali's military power, began raiding Mali's northern provinces with increasing boldness. Perhaps most damaging was the brain drain. Timbuktu's scholars, who had been attracted to Mali by generous salaries and excellent working conditions, were no longer as firmly integrated into Malian society. When rival kingdoms offered them better positions and higher salaries in Songhai cities, many accepted. As the scholars left, the quality of education declined. The next generation of administrators, judges, and economic managers weren't as well trained in the empire's complex systems. As the quality of education declined, the quality of administration declined as well. The libraries of Timbuktu, which had once contained the cutting-edge scholarship of the Islamic world, were decades behind the latest developments. The empire's enemies had access to firearms, while Mali's military still relied primarily on traditional weapons and tactics. By the time the Moroccan army crossed the Sahara in 1591, Mali was already a shadow of its former self. The conquest of Timbuktu was devastating. But it wasn't the cause of Mali's decline. It was the final blow to an empire that had been weakening for decades. The tragedy of Mali's fall wasn't just a loss of political power or economic wealth. It was the destruction of knowledge and the erasure of memory. The Moroccan conquest of Timbuktu in 1591 wasn't just a theft of Timbuktu's wealth. It was the destruction of its intellectual community. The scholars who survived the conquest fled to other cities or went into hiding. The libraries were looted, with the most valuable manuscripts taken to Morocco or sold to private collectors. Many manuscripts were simply destroyed, burned for fuel, used as packing material, or left to rot in abandoned buildings. The city that had once rivaled Cairo and Baghdad became a provincial outpost in a Moroccan colonial empire. But the destruction of Mali's intellectual heritage wasn't just a historical accident. It was followed by a deliberate campaign to erase the civilization from historical memory. European scholars, who were beginning to write comprehensive histories of the world, largely ignored or dismissed African civilizations. When they mentioned Mali at all, it was as a curiosity, a kingdom of noble savages whose wealth was attributed to lucky geography rather than sophisticated economic systems, or as a legend created by Arab storytellers. For over 400 years, one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history was essentially forgotten. The architectural marvels of Mali were allowed to crumble into dust. The manuscripts that survived were hidden away in private collections, unknown to the wider world. The sophisticated systems of governance, trade, and education that Mali had developed were lost to history. But the truth, as it always does, eventually emerged. In the late 20th century, scholars began to rediscover Mali's manuscripts, hidden in private libraries and family collections across West Africa. These manuscripts revealed a civilization of stunning sophistication, a civilization that had made advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that rivaled anything produced in medieval Europe or the Islamic heartlands. The Golden Age of Mali reminds us that greatness can emerge anywhere, at any time, among any people. It reminds us that the history we're taught is often incomplete, shaped by the biases and limitations of those who wrote it. And it reminds us that civilizations, no matter how powerful or sophisticated, are fragile things vulnerable to conquest, decline, and the deliberate erasure of memory. But perhaps most importantly, the story of Mali reminds us that knowledge, once created, is remarkably difficult to destroy completely. The manuscripts survived. The architectural principles survived. The memory survived, passed down through generations of griots and scholars who refused to let their history die. Today, the manuscripts of Timbuktu are being preserved, digitized, and studied by scholars from around the world. The architectural techniques developed during Mali's golden age are being revived and adapted for modern use. The story of Mansa Musa and the empire he helped build is finally being told with the depth and nuance it deserves. The golden age of Mali wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a demonstration of what African civilization could achieve when given the resources, stability, and freedom to flourish. It was a reminder that the narrative of African history as a story of primitive tribes waiting to be civilized by European colonizers is not just wrong, it as a deliberate distortion designed to justify conquest and exploitation. Understanding Mali's true history doesn't just correct the historical record. It challenges us to question what other histories have been erased, what other civilizations have been forgotten, what other achievements have been attributed to the wrong people or dismissed as impossible. The story of Mali is ultimately a story about the power of knowledge, how it's created, how it's preserved, how it's transmitted, and how it can be lost. It's a reminder that every civilization, no matter how powerful, is only a few generations away from being forgotten if its knowledge is unactively preserved and passed on. And it's a call to action for us today, in an age when information is more abundant than ever before. We have both an unprecedented opportunity and an unprecedented responsibility to preserve and transmit knowledge, not just the knowledge that confirms our existing narratives, but the knowledge that challenges them, that complicates them, that forces us to see the world and its history in new and more accurate ways. The golden age of Mali ended centuries ago, but its lessons about the importance of education, the power of economic innovation, the necessity of good governance, and the fragility of even the greatest civilizations remain as relevant today as they were in the 14th century. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 was meant to demonstrate Mali's wealth and sophistication to the Islamic world. In a way, it succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but not in the way he intended. The story of his journey, and the golden age it represented, eventually reached Europe and challenged everything Europeans thought they knew about Africa. But it took centuries for that story to be told accurately and completely. And even today, most people know Mansa Musa only as the richest man in history, a simplistic label that reduces a sophisticated ruler and a complex civilization to a single data point about wealth. The real story of Mali, the story of Sundiata's coalition building, of the Mandan Charter's progressive principles, of the sophisticated mining and trading systems, of Timbuktu's universities and libraries, of the scholars who pushed the boundaries of human knowledge, is far more interesting and far more important than any simple story about gold. It's a story that deserves to be told in full, with all its complexity and nuance. It's a story that challenges our assumptions about medieval Africa, about the history of science and scholarship, about the rise and fall of civilizations. It's a story that reminds us that history is always more complicated, more interesting, and more surprising than the simplified narratives we're often taught. And perhaps most importantly, it's a story that's still being written. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are still being studied. New discoveries are still being made. Our understanding of Mali's golden age is still evolving. The scholars of Timbuktu spent centuries creating, preserving, and transmitting knowledge. The least we can do is ensure that their work and the civilization that made it possible is remembered, studied, and appreciated for what it truly was. One of the great achievements of human civilization, comparable to anything produced in medieval Europe, the Islamic heartlands, or anywhere else in the world. That's the real legacy of Mali's golden age. Not just the gold, not just the architectural marvels, not just the political and economic innovations, but the demonstration that African civilization, given the opportunity, could achieve anything that any other civilization could achieve. And that's a lesson that the world is still learning. Centuries after Mansa Musa's legendary pilgrimage showed the medieval world that there was far more to Africa than they had ever imagined. But Mansa Musa did something that left the entire court speechless. As a gesture of goodwill, he began distributing gold with such lavish generosity that within weeks, he actually ran low on spending money. So he borrowed gold from Cairo's merchants at interest, becoming perhaps the first ruler in history to take out an international loan, not out of necessity, but as a financial strategy to stabilize the currency market he had disrupted with his own generosity. The economic impact was immediate and dramatic. Cairo's gold market, suddenly flushed with Malian gold, began purchasing goods from European and Asian traders at prices that made those merchants wealthy beyond their dreams. But more importantly, it forced European and Asian powers to develop a new understanding of the political and economic systems that produced this wealth. For the first time, European merchants and diplomats began to understand that there was a sophisticated civilization in West Africa that they knew almost nothing about. But what happened in Mecca itself was even more significant for the future of Mali and the broader Islamic world. In Mecca, Mansa Musa met with scholars, merchants, and diplomats from across the Islamic world. He learned about new technologies, new ideas about governance, and new approaches to education. He recruited architects, scholars, and craftsmen to return with him to Mali. He established diplomatic relationships with rulers from Egypt to Persia, creating networks that could potentially allow Mali to trade directly with India, China, and Southeast Asia. For more historic videos, please subscribe, comment, and like the video.